The night was clear, illuminated by soft lights reflecting in the windows of the city's most elegant restaurants. The wind carried the scent of sophisticated food mixed with expensive perfume, and my footsteps echoed on the sidewalk dampened by the fine drizzle. I wasn't there for dinner, nor for a stroll. Each step was heavy, as if something inside me was pulling me back, but the certainty of what I would find pushed me forward. My heart already knew, but my mind still tried to deny it. That's when, through the large glass window, I saw her. Sitting at the table, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. The kind of smile that had once been mine, but now was directed at another man. Their hands touched as if sharing a forbidden secret, as if the entire world around them were just a blur. And then, without hesitation, I walked through the door. She didn't see me coming until my shadow covered the table. When she looked at me, her smile died instantly, and her eyes widened in a silence that screamed louder than any words could express. My gaze didn't tremble, but inside me everything was shattering. The voices around me faded, the silverware stopped clanging against the plates, and the only sound was the rapid beating of my own heart. I said what I needed to say, dryly, directly, like ripping a bandage from a wound that will never heal, that I wanted a divorce, right then and there. She tried to speak, but the words stuck between her lips, as if she'd swallowed her own air. Her eyes begged for a time I wasn't willing to give. I pulled away before she could recover. In that moment, everything we'd built together flashed before my eyes like a cruel film. The sleepless nights working to give her what she dreamed of. The simple gestures, the lingering hugs, the conversations in the early morning light. Every detail felt heavier now that I knew that, for her, none of it had been enough. And it wasn't the physical betrayal that hurt the most, but the silent abandonment, her choosing someone who represented everything I'd never been. I left the restaurant empty-hearted, unconcerned with the rain that was beginning to thicken. I felt the water mix with tears I didn't want to admit were there. The following days were a plunge into silence. I relived that scene every morning, as if it were a punishment. I wondered when she'd started pulling away, when I'd stopped being her choice. Maybe there were signs I'd ignored. Maybe love, when it begins to die, doesn't scream, it just goes out like a candle losing its flame. And deep down, as much as it hurt to admit, it wasn't just her who had changed. I'd also lost myself amidst my responsibilities, believing that love was about keeping up with the bills and forgetting to cherish the small gestures. But still, nothing justified the deep cut she'd made. The months passed. I watched her leave, as resolute as someone who closes a door and doesn't look back. I wondered how easy it was for her to move on, how happy she must have been with her new choice. But time has a curious way of revealing the truth. As I tried to rebuild my life, I heard, through scattered fragments, that the man she had left me for was not what he seemed. The smiles she had initially displayed turned into weary expressions. The passionate conversations became endless arguments. And little by little, she began to taste the bitter taste of her own decisions. He didn't value her as I once did. He treated her as disposable, and in the end, he left her exactly as he had left me, alone, in pieces. Still, I wasn't happy to see her suffer. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated by fate, but the other part, perhaps the hardest to face, remembered all the good times we'd shared, and that made it impossible to feel pleasure in her downfall. That's when our paths crossed again. She saw me before I could help it, and we stared at each other for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Her eyes carried a weight I knew, regret. And maybe even shame. She approached, hesitant, like someone unsure whether she'll be welcomed or rejected. The conversation we had that night was filled with silences. She told me, without needing to go into too much detail, that her life hadn't followed the script she'd imagined. That the forbidden love she'd risked everything for had proved fragile, selfish, and ruthless. And that, try as she might, she couldn't forget what she'd left behind. I listened attentively to every word, but I couldn't tell if it affected me. When she finished, she stared at me, perhaps waiting for me to say there was still a chance for us. And it was at that moment that I realized something strange. I no longer felt the same pain. The love that had once made me silently beg her to stay had become a distant, almost peaceful memory. There was hurt, sure, but there was no longer room to take back what had been broken. I told her I forgave her, and I meant it. Not so she would feel better, but so I could finally move on without chains. And I did. Fate, however, likes to play with irony. Shortly thereafter, I met someone who didn't carry the shadows of the past, someone who looked at me as if I were a choice and not a convenience option. And it was alongside this new story that I realized, with piercing clarity, that certain losses are, in fact, liberations in disguise. But the curious thing is that, even after everything, there's still one last conversation that never happened between us. A conversation that could change everything, or maybe just put a definitive end to what we once believed to be love. And that conversation is closer than I imagined. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never condone any kind of betrayal, our stories are entirely fictional and carry a single message, to show how betrayal can destroy lives, hearts, and futures. Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear is intense, profound, and will stir every emotion in you. Take a deep breath, the shocking story is about to begin. His name was Daniel, and hers was Laura. Two common names, but together they carried a story that seemed, at first glance, written to last a lifetime. They met almost casually, at a cafe where they were both attending different meetings, but a scheduling conflict meant they shared the same table. Daniel, always polite and observant, offered a discreet smile and light conversation, while Laura, accustomed to protecting herself from the advances she received, found in this man a way of speaking that was not invasive, but engaging. What began as a casual encounter became the beginning of a sequence of days that seemed to have been stitched together by fate itself. Since then, they never lost contact and, before long, their lives began to revolve around each other. Daniel was the kind of man who took pride in what he achieved through his own efforts. Coming from a simple family, he knew how to appreciate every small step forward, every goal achieved. He worked hard, but didn't let that dim his ability to appreciate the moments that truly mattered. He enjoyed cooking for Laura on weekends, preparing impromptu dinners with whatever was in the fridge and seeing her smile blossom upon tasting the first dish. Laura, in turn, had an energy that lit up any room. She was communicative, full of ideas, always involved in new projects, and surrounded by friends who admired her spontaneous way of life. But there was something about her that Daniel admired more than anything else, the way she seemed to find beauty in everything, even on the darkest days. Together, they built a home that reflected their personalities. The living room was cozy, with books scattered on shelves and an armchair where Daniel liked to read at night. The kitchen, his favorite space, always had aromas ranging from strong spices to delicate sweets. In the bedroom, the attention to every detail demonstrated how much they valued comfort, from the choice of curtains to the soft touch of the sheets. To anyone who knew them, they formed a balanced couple, where each complemented the other's small flaws, creating a natural harmony. In the early years, gestures of affection were abundant. Unexpected midweek outings, small letters left on the breakfast table, long hugs after tiring days. Daniel was proud to be by Laura's side, and she seemed to reciprocate with the same intensity. There was no doubt that their relationship had a solid foundation, built on patience, complicity, and respect. Important decisions were made together, always considering each other's dreams and plans. But, as with any long-term relationship, time began to bring subtle changes. Daniel began to take on more responsibilities at work, taking on larger projects that demanded not only his dedication but also sleepless nights and frequent travel. Laura, at the same time, increasingly immersed herself in her social circle and activities that kept her busy. It wasn't something that seemed worrisome at first, after all, they both supported each other and understood the demands of adult life. However, these quiet changes began to shape a new dynamic between them, one in which physical presence was no longer accompanied by the emotional connection they had always had. Despite this, there were still moments of tenderness reminiscent of the early days. When Daniel returned from a trip, Laura always prepared something special for him, and he, in return, brought small gifts that showed he was thinking of her even from afar. They still laughed together, still shared confidences, but there was a difference in intensity, something perhaps only those who had known love at its peak could perceive. Small silences emerged, not the comfortable silences of those who understand each other without words, but pauses that concealed unspoken thoughts. Laura continued to be seen as an admirable woman by everyone around her. Intelligent, charismatic, and able to adapt to any social situation. Daniel, on the other hand, was respected for his ethics and determination. Together, they were the picture of an admirable couple, and perhaps that's why no one suspected that their relationship, though seemingly stable, was no longer immune to the cracks of time. Their life together, though comfortable, was beginning to feel more like a well-managed routine than a living passion. Daniel's trips became more frequent, and with them came periods when the house seemed larger and quieter to Laura. She filled this void with social engagements, gatherings with friends, and new activities that kept her from feeling lonely. Daniel, in turn, missed her presence on the days he returned and couldn't find her. Still, he never stopped trying to preserve the bonds he believed were unbreakable. He reserved weekends for getaways, organized dinners on special occasions, and tried, in some way, to rekindle the flame he knew was fading. Close friends noticed something was changing, but it wasn't the kind of change announced with abrupt gestures or constant arguments. It was something more subtle, almost invisible, infiltrating everyday life and undermining what once seemed solid. The lingering glances that no longer existed, the deep conversations that gave way to quick exchanges of practical information. And, like so many stories that begin with promises of eternity, this one too was entering uncharted territory, where affection still existed, but was no longer enough to fill all the gaps. However, even with this new phase, there was still a foundation of respect and shared history that held them together. Daniel continued to believe that any crisis could be overcome through dialogue and mutual effort, and Laura, despite increasingly seeking out her own experiences, still maintained an almost automatic care for him. In the eyes of the world, there was nothing wrong. What happened between them was kept hidden between the lines, in averted glances and in words that never ended. The landscape seemed stable, but it was like a castle built on the edge of a cliff, solid on the outside, but vulnerable to slow, silent erosion. And at some point, inevitably, something would have to happen to shatter or redefine what still held together what had once been the certainty of a lifelong love. Time, ever relentless, continued to flow, taking with it pieces of the history they had once sworn to protect, without them realizing that, step by step, they were moving away from where they began. As the months passed, the distance between Daniel and Laura was no longer just physical and began to manifest itself in more subtle, yet more painful, ways. He still dedicated some of his time to planning ways to rekindle their connection, but he noticed that his gestures seemed to lose their impact, as if they no longer reached her in the same way they once did. Laura, on the other hand, seemed increasingly involved in commitments that didn't include her husband. There were nights when she would arrive later than usual, claiming meetings or get-togethers with friends, and although Daniel wasn't the controlling type, the frequency of this began to weigh on him. He didn't want to suspect, but the feeling that something was slipping away from his grasp began to creep into his thoughts like a silent shadow. It was common for Daniel to return home after a tiring day to find the living room dark, dinner still uncooked, and a quick note on the table saying she wouldn't be back early. At first, he accepted it without question, believing everyone had a right to their own space and activities. However, there was something different about the way she talked about these get-togethers. The excitement in her tone wasn't the same as when she talked about work or longtime friends. She was more restrained, as if there were details she chose to omit. Daniel noticed, but preferred to keep it to himself, believing that a hasty conversation could create a problem that might not even exist. Weekends, once reserved for the couple, became increasingly fragmented. Daniel would try to propose short trips or even simple outings, but his responses were always accompanied by unavoidable commitments or a sudden tiredness that made her prefer to stay home, alone. Their shared complicity was replaced by practical conversations, quick exchanges about bills, responsibilities, and schedules. Even when they were together, there seemed to be an invisible wall between them, something that prevented words from going beyond the trivial. One night, returning early from a work trip, Daniel decided to surprise her. He bought flowers on the way, imagining the smile she would give him upon arriving unannounced. But when he entered, the house was empty. The silence lacked the tranquility of before, it was dense, almost suffocating. He left the flowers on the table and waited, staring out the window at the hustle and bustle of the street. When Laura finally entered, her gaze betrayed a brief moment of surprise, followed by a controlled expression. She justified her absence by saying she was with friends, but avoided elaborating on the subject. Daniel, not wanting to create a confrontation, swallowed the uncomfortable feeling that night had left. The following weeks brought more signs. Phone calls she answered in another room, messages read quickly and then deleted immediately afterward, subtle changes in the way she dressed for going out. Small details that, in isolation, might not mean anything, but together formed a picture that was hard to ignore. Daniel began to feel a weight on his chest whenever he saw her getting ready to go out without him, as if he were watching something slip away forever and was powerless to stop it. The turning point began on a Friday. Daniel had finished work early and, while organizing some paperwork at home, found a ticket to a very exclusive wine event scheduled for that very evening. There was nothing unusual about Laura attending such events, but the ticket was for 2 people. He didn't remember being invited or her mentioning anything about it. This sparked an unease he couldn't ignore. He pocketed the ticket and, hours later, decided to go. The ambience was elegant, with low lights and soft music filling the air. He walked slowly through the room, scanning the tables occupied by couples and small groups. Until, in the background, he spotted a familiar silhouette. Laura was sitting across from a man Daniel had never seen before. There was something different about her now, it wasn't just the dress she rarely wore, but the way her eyes sparkled and her body leaned forward slightly, hanging on his every word. For a few moments, Daniel stood still, as if trying to convince himself he was mistaken. But then he saw their hands touch, not by chance, but as a natural, intimate, repeated gesture. It was a touch he knew well, for it had once been his. The ground seemed to give way beneath his feet. The pain came not in screams, but in a silent wave that invaded every part of his body. He didn't immediately advance to the table. He watched for what seemed like endless seconds, feeling the crushing weight of reality settle in. Her every smile, every exchange of glances, every tilt of her face was a cruel reminder that something precious had been taken from him without warning. Finally, he summoned the strength to walk over. As he approached, Laura looked up and froze. The man beside her also flinched, instantly realizing who stood before him. Daniel didn't need to raise his voice. He simply said what he needed to, directly, sensing that any further words would be a waste. The silence that followed was absolute. Laura tried to say something, but her mouth seemed incapable of forming sentences. Daniel didn't wait. He turned and left, leaving behind the muffled sound of conversations resuming in the background. Outside, the cold night air bit his face, but not enough to dispel the suffocating heat in his chest. He didn't know exactly what would come next, but he was certain that this night would mark a point of no return. And, even without imagining it, there was something much bigger about to be revealed, something that would change not only the way he saw Laura, but the entire meaning of their experience thus far. Their reunion happened weeks after that night that changed everything. Daniel didn't reach out to Laura, didn't send messages, didn't seek answers. His silence wasn't just an absence of words, it was an insurmountable barrier built to protect what remained of his peace. However, one gray afternoon, as he was leaving a cafe where he was finishing some work, he saw her standing on the sidewalk, looking at him as if trying to find the courage to approach. There was no escape. She took a few hesitant steps, stopping a few meters away, and the first thing out of her mouth was a request to talk. Daniel, without changing his tone, replied that he didn't have much to say, but that if they wanted to end things for good, they could do so right then and there. They sat on a bench in the nearest park. The cold wind rustled the fallen leaves on the ground, and the silence between them seemed heavier than the air around them. Laura, her voice trembling, began by saying she didn't want to justify anything, but she needed to explain. Daniel crossed his arms and kept his gaze fixed on her, in no rush to interrupt. She explained, with long pauses and deep breaths, that after that night, the man she was with suddenly pulled away. There were no dramatic arguments, just a cruel and swift distancing. Soon, she discovered he was involved with another woman, someone younger, someone who seemed to fill a momentary need that Laura no longer met. Daniel listened without showing satisfaction or compassion. But then came the part that would change everything. Laura said that, in the days following that discovery, she realized something that made her painfully realize what she had lost. She was at a restaurant, trying to distract herself with a friend, when she saw Daniel enter with someone. It wasn't just the presence of another person beside him that impacted her, but the way he looked at her. It was the same look he'd had when they first met, a look filled with genuine interest, care, and admiration. Their conversation flowed naturally, their laughter was light, and Laura realized that, despite everything that had happened, he had found a way to move on. Daniel, until that moment, hadn't told anyone about it. He met this new person by chance, without seeking it, and was surprised by the feeling of being seen and heard in a way he hadn't in a long time. It wasn't about replacing someone, but about realizing there was still room to rebuild his life without carrying the weight of the past. Laura took a deep breath and confessed that, in that moment when she saw him smile at another woman, she knew that nothing she could say or do could bring him back to the way he was before. The conversation deepened. She admitted she'd indulged in a fantasy, believing she was searching for something she lacked, but in the process, she'd destroyed the most solid foundation she'd ever had. She said she'd spent nights remembering details she'd once taken for granted, the coffee he'd made her every morning, the way he'd adjust the blanket over her when she'd fallen asleep on the couch, the silent care she'd only realized after she'd lost him. Tears began to flow as she said she'd never thought she'd need to beg for his forgiveness, but that now she wanted nothing more. Daniel remained silent for a few moments, each word weighing heavily on him. There was no longer the anger that there had been before, but there was also no room for new beginnings. He said, in a firm voice, that he forgave her. That he would not harbor hatred, that he wished her peace, but that what had existed between them no longer existed as it once had. He explained that forgiveness was not the same as getting back together, and that, while he still respected everything they had experienced, he could not ignore that the bond of trust had been broken forever. Laura closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back her tears. She said she understood, but hearing those words was like feeling the last thread connecting her to him snap. She tried to touch his hand, but Daniel gently pulled back, not hostilely, but as if setting a limit that could no longer be crossed. The silence that followed was filled with bitter acceptance. Before standing, he added something that stuck with her. He said that, in the end, betrayal wasn't the only reason they couldn't get back together. It was the way she chose someone who had no intention of staying, exchanging a built-up history for something that lasted only as long as it was new. Laura, lacking the strength to respond, simply nodded. She knew any argument would ring hollow in the face of that clarity. As they walked away in opposite directions, Daniel felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I had ended a cycle without yelling, without arguing, only with the certainty that I was no longer a prisoner of a pain that had once seemed endless. Laura, for her part, carried the weight of knowing there was no longer room to regain what she'd lost. And, deep down, perhaps this was the cruelest part, realizing that his forgiveness didn't mean a second chance, but rather the final chapter of a story she herself had decided to close long before she was ready to deal with the consequences. Daniel left the park and continued walking aimlessly, letting the cold bite into his face and help him organize his still swirling thoughts. The encounter with Laura had closed a chapter, but it had also left doors ajar to memories he didn't want to revisit. As he walked, he realized that, for the first time in a long time, he no longer felt the need to go back in time to seek answers. What he needed to know had already been said, and what wasn't said no longer mattered. He walked through the streets illuminated by the first light of night, passing storefronts and overhearing fragments of conversations that had nothing to do with his life, but which, somehow, helped him remember that the world kept turning, even when its very axis had been shaken. In the days that followed, work became an even more solid refuge. Meetings, deadlines, and daily decisions were a way to keep my mind occupied and my thoughts aligned with the present. Even so, there were moments when memories surfaced without asking permission, like when I passed a restaurant I used to frequent with Laura or when someone's perfume in the elevator brought back images of nights shared. But these memories no longer held the same suffocating weight, they were just memories, without the power to hold you down. The new relationship that had begun to blossom before his reunion with Laura also gained ground. Clara, the woman he met almost accidentally, had a different way of approaching him. She didn't pressure, didn't demand, didn't seek answers to questions he wasn't yet ready to answer. She was simply there, present, offering conversations that flowed naturally and with a lightness he hadn't remembered feeling in a long time. On a sunny Saturday, Clara invited him to a cultural event downtown. He accepted, and that day he realized how it was possible to feel part of something new without carrying the constant weight of comparisons. Meanwhile, Laura was trying to regain control of her life. The days seemed longer since their conversation in the park, and the routine, which had once felt like freedom, now felt like an empty space difficult to fill. Friends who had previously been a constant presence began to drift away, either because they didn't know how to deal with what had happened or because they realized there wasn't much they could contribute to a situation that seemed to be spinning in circles. She began to occupy herself with courses, short solo trips, and family reunions, but Daniel's absence was a fixed point in everything she did. A month later, the two met again by chance. It was in a supermarket, in the wine aisle, ironically, the same kind of place that had been the date of the revelation. Daniel was choosing a bottle when he noticed her approaching. Laura hesitated before speaking, but eventually asked how he was. He responded cordially, without being cold, but also without opening himself to further conversation. She commented on how life was different and, on a whim, asked about Clara. Daniel didn't elaborate, simply saying he was meeting someone. The brief smile that accompanied this statement was enough for Laura to realize he was sincere, and that this new presence in his life was real and meaningful. The days that followed that encounter were different for Laura. She began to understand, definitively, that there was no longer room for waiting for a return. With each memory, each time she thought about what could have been, she felt the only way out was to accept and move on. However, acceptance didn't come easily. At night, the silence in the house seemed more intense, and the walls seemed to reflect echoes of past conversations. In contrast, Daniel was experiencing a moment of internal transition. Although he was allowing himself to get to know Clara, he didn't feel the need to rush anything. They hung out, laughed, and shared experiences, but there was a silent respect for the time it took for it to become something solid. Clara didn't ask about Laura, didn't delve into his past, she simply focused on what they were building in the present. This care led Daniel to begin to see her not just as a companion, but as a real possibility for the future. One night, during a simple dinner at her house, Clara mentioned, unassumingly, how admirable she found the way he seemed to handle change. Daniel smiled slightly, without going into details, but deep down he knew this apparent tranquility stemmed from a painful and slow process, requiring courage to let go of what could not be recovered. He looked at her, poured more wine, and realized that, for the first time, he felt ready to look forward without fear of looking back. Meanwhile, Laura, in a gesture that required all her remaining courage, wrote a letter to Daniel. It wasn't a request for him back, nor an attempt to reopen conversations. It was simply a thank you, albeit a painful one, for all the years they'd been happy and for his ability to forgive her, even when she didn't deserve it. She left the letter at the entrance of his building, without waiting for a reply. Daniel found it when he got home, read it in silence, and, when finished, tucked it inside a book on the shelf. He didn't reply, but he knew that gesture was the definitive closure of everything. Life went on. Time, which previously seemed to drag on, began to take on a more balanced rhythm for both of them. Daniel and Clara continued to grow closer, discovering new affinities, while Laura began to forge new paths for herself, albeit with scars that would never completely disappear. What remained between them was a silent respect and the certainty that, despite the end, there was a time when they truly loved each other. Fate, however, still had one last meeting in store. Unplanned, unexpected, just another of those coincidences that test whether what has been resolved internally can withstand direct contact. And that moment, when it arrived, would definitively reveal how far each had come. The last unexpected encounter happened on a Sunday morning. Daniel had decided to walk to the market to buy fresh fruit and enjoy the mild weather. As he crossed the main street, amid the flower stalls and the sound of lively conversation, he spotted Laura, alone, holding a basket with some groceries. She seemed distracted, fiddling with her cell phone, until she looked up and their eyes met. There was no surprise, none of the tense hesitation that had marked their previous encounters. It was as if they both silently acknowledged that there was no longer room for discussion or explanations. Still, she approached slowly, almost as if respecting a sacred space. They exchanged simple greetings, but the conversation inevitably grew. Laura talked about work, about recent changes, and Daniel spoke a little about the new projects he was working on. There was a warmth between them that hadn't existed in the recent past, as if time had smoothed away the rough edges. At one point, she paused, took a deep breath, and asked if he was happy. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked around, observed the movement of people, and then said yes, but that the happiness he felt was different from what he'd imagined years ago. It wasn't intense and uncontrollable, but calm and consistent. Laura nodded, and a melancholy smile crossed her face, revealing that she understood exactly what he meant. They walked together for a few meters, chatting about trivial things, until she touched his arm and asked them to stop. She said there was something she needed to share, not to change anything, but because she thought he deserved to know. She explained that, in the months after their separation, she had the chance to reconnect with the man she had cheated on, but she refused. Not because there wasn't an opportunity, but because she finally realized she didn't want to repeat the same mistake. She admitted that the loneliness she felt wasn't for the lover she had lost, but for the husband she had driven away. Daniel listened attentively, and although he felt no desire to get back together, he recognized the importance of that moment for her. It was as if she was restoring a shred of dignity to herself, accepting her choices in a mature way. As they spoke, a dilemma silently formed in Daniel's mind. Forgiving someone had been a difficult decision, but remaining present in some way, even if only as a friend, was another matter. He knew that maintaining contact could blur the boundaries he'd established to move forward, but he also knew that severing all ties would close the door on a kind of coexistence that, despite everything, could be healthy. Clara, on the other hand, was someone with whom he was building something meaningful, and he needed to consider how she would feel knowing he was still talking to Laura. When they reached the end of the street, they decided to say goodbye right there. Laura thanked her for the time they'd spent talking and for her patience in listening. Daniel, in a few words, said he hoped she found peace in her own decisions and that life had good paths to offer. They didn't exchange hugs, just a final look that carried the weight of everything that couldn't be said. In the days that followed, that conversation recurred to Daniel more often than he cared to admit. There was no resentment, but there was a certain discomfort in thinking that part of his story was still open, like a book that ends with blank pages. One silent night, as Clara slept beside him, he wondered if he was being fair to himself by keeping any memories alive. The point wasn't about returning to the past, but about learning to deal with it without allowing it to overshadow the present. Clara, perceptive as she was, noticed something was occupying his thoughts. Over breakfast, she mentioned that she felt he was becoming distant at times. Daniel debated whether to tell her about the encounter and decided to be honest. He explained that he had seen Laura, that they had talked, and that it had sparked reflections on how to move forward fully. Clara listened without interrupting, and in the end simply said that she trusted him but hoped that trust would be reciprocated with clarity and respect. The calm way she handled the matter made Daniel realize that she absolutely did not want to jeopardize what they were building. Laura, for her part, began to reorganize her life more consciously. She began investing time in activities that truly brought her satisfaction, not just filled the void. She enrolled in photography classes, traveled to places she'd always wanted to see, and reconnected with family relationships she'd neglected. But despite all these changes, there were times when the past loomed like a silent shadow. She knew she couldn't erase what she'd done, and that the image of Daniel moving on with someone else would forever be a bittersweet memory. The approaching end of the year brought a period of evaluation for both of them. Daniel reflected on how he had changed, not only in his relationships, but also in his understanding of love. With Clara, he realized he didn't need to live in constant intensity to feel security and affection. Laura, looking back, recognized that some of her choices were motivated by an illusory search, and that the consequence was losing something she would never find in the same way. The moral dilemma for Daniel remained: maintain occasional contact with Laura, offering a distant friendship, or definitively end any ties, ensuring that the past no longer had room to influence the present. It was a decision he knew he couldn't postpone for long, and one that would require more than mere rationality. It was a choice that tested his very definition of loyalty, not only to Clara, but to himself. This question, which seemed small to any outside observer, grew silently within him. After all, it wasn't just about moving on, but about doing so in a way that left no room for future regrets. And, with the new year approaching, Daniel knew he would need to make a decision that would define, once and for all, how his story with Laura would be remembered and where, within himself, it would be stored. The days leading up to Christmas brought the city awash in lights and decorated shop windows, but for Daniel, the festive atmosphere held a different weight. Clara had invited him to spend the holidays with her family in another city, and he accepted, feeling that this step represented more than just a trip. It was the first time since their separation that he had so clearly placed himself in another person's life. The departure was scheduled for the morning of the 23rd, but the night before, an unforeseen event changed the course of events. As he walked home after a last-minute meeting, he spotted Laura sitting alone on a bench near the entrance of an old building. Her face was partially hidden by a scarf, but her vacant gaze betrayed a heaviness he recognized from afar. The hesitation was brief. He approached and asked if everything was okay. She looked up and tried to smile, but the gesture didn't hold. She said she'd gone out to meet friends but had given up on the way. Daniel suggested she go home, but she asked for a few minutes, claiming she didn't want to go back yet. The icy wind blew through the street, and he, in an automatic gesture, took off his gloves and handed them to her. Laura accepted without argument, and they remained silent for a few moments, observing the almost non-existent movement at that hour. It was Laura who broke the silence, asking if he had yet found in Clara what was missing in their relationship. Daniel, taken aback, took a while to answer. He said Clara wasn't a replacement, but someone with whom he was building something new, based on who he had become, not what he once was. Laura looked down, clutching her gloves as if squeezing them could ease the tension she felt. Then she confessed that the greatest burden she carried wasn't losing her marriage, but losing the chance to show she could be different. She said she knew she didn't deserve such an opportunity, but that, seeing him find happiness with someone else, she realized the love he offered her was far greater than she could ever appreciate. Daniel listened without interrupting. Her tone wasn't dramatic, but it carried an honesty he couldn't remember hearing before. He replied that he believed in people's ability to change, but that some changes happened too late to save what was already broken. He also said he hoped she wouldn't spend the rest of her life looking back, as that would prevent her from building something real. Laura bit her lower lip, and with her voice almost fading in the cold air, asked if he still thought about her when he was alone. The question hung in the air for a few seconds. Daniel admitted that sometimes he remembered, but not like before, not with longing, but with the feeling of having lived something that had served its time. A thick silence formed between them, not of hostility, but of mutual understanding. Laura thanked him for not responding angrily and confessed that she saw him as a stronger person than she could have imagined. Daniel, in turn, said that strength wasn't about not feeling pain, but about moving forward despite it. Then he stood up, saying he had to go, and offered to accompany her to her apartment building. On the way, they exchanged few words, but there was a strange peace in it, as if what they needed to say had already been said. The next morning, Daniel set off with Clara on his journey. Her family's warm welcome provided a stark contrast to the conversation of the previous night. The laughter, the stories told at the table, the naturalness with which Clara included him at every turn, all of it made him feel exactly where he was supposed to be. Yet, in rare moments of distraction, Laura's words returned to him, not as a temptation, but as a reminder of how fragile what we take for granted can be. Laura spent Christmas alone, declining family invitations, perhaps because she didn't want to face questions or stares from those who knew her story. She used the time to write, record memories, and for the first time admitted to herself that she needed to close that chapter definitively. It wasn't enough to simply let time pass, she would have to find a way to forgive herself so that the burden would lessen. At the end of January, Daniel and Clara returned from their trip closer than ever. Their intense relationship had revealed both compatibility and differences, but unlike in the past, he felt a mutual commitment to nurturing their relationship. One night, as they walked through a park lit only by moonlight, Clara commented that she perceived a rare serenity in him, as if he were finally at peace with the choices he had made. Daniel smiled and said he had learned that peace is not the absence of pain, but acceptance. It was that same week that Laura, determined to take the final step, sent Daniel a final message. It wasn't long, nor was it laden with overly emotional emotion. She simply thanked him for the sincerity with which he had always treated her, even when there was no reason for kindness, and wished him happiness, without any more interruptions from the past. Daniel responded briefly, wishing her the same. The exchange ended there, with a simplicity that contrasted with all the weight that had once existed between them. The moral dilemma he carried gradually dissolved, not because there was a dramatic decision, but because life, with its inevitable flow, pushed each of them in different directions. Laura began appearing on social media involved in new projects, traveling, surrounded by different people. Daniel, in turn, deepened his bond with Clara, allowing himself to build plans that didn't include ghosts. It was as if the chapter had finally been written to the end, without erasures, without notes in the margins. Still, deep down, there was an awareness that certain stories don't fade away, they remain part of the foundation of who we become. And perhaps this was the hardest lesson, accepting that lost love doesn't cease to exist, it simply becomes something we carry forever, not as a chain, but as a scar that no longer hurts to the touch. Daniel and Laura knew this, each in their own way, and perhaps it was precisely this awareness that allowed them, in the end, to each follow their own path as lightly as possible. The turn of the year brought a kind of inner silence to Daniel, not of emptiness, but of completion. He and Clara went to the first concert of the season, sitting near the back and sharing a blanket because the room was too cold for January. At one point, as the orchestra modulates into a slow melody, he feels his body relaxing to an unknown degree, as if a door has finally been locked on the right side. Clara rests her head on his shoulder and, without asking for any promise, whispers that she feels safe there. The gesture demands nothing, only offers. Daniel puts his arm around her and, for the first time, feels like he can belong to the present without restraints, without needing to check the rearview mirror to gauge his route. There is no euphoria, there is stability. As he leaves, he walks into the cold wind and is overcome by a calm clarity. The time has come to close the last thread that still connects his story to the past, not out of contempt, but out of respect for what is being born. The next night, he wrote a short message to Laura, letting her know he would maintain a permanent distance to protect what he was building. He thanked her for what she once was, without reopening wounds. He hit send and put the phone down, feeling his breath even out in his chest. Laura read the message in the kitchen, in the early hours of the morning, with the kettle whistling on the stove like a time alarm. The text was simple, honest, and it touched him more deeply than any argument they'd ever had. He leaned against the sink and breathed slowly until the water boiled. As the steam rose, he remembered every path he'd walked trying to convince him that love had a lifespan, and he understood that the true end didn't happen the day one left, but the moment the other learned to stay without looking back. He didn't cry. The emotion that came was a kind of sad, mature gratitude that demanded no return. He poured the tea, sat down with his notebook, and wrote a single sentence at the top of the page: "There is no forgiveness that gives back time, there is forgiveness that gives back dignity." Below, he began to list everything he needed to face without makeup: the urge to run away from what hurt, the masked need for adventure, the addiction to confusing novelty with depth. He only closed the notebook when Dawn was already touching the window with blue fingers and the water in the kettle had gone cold. The following weeks called for quiet decisions. Daniel did something he'd been putting off: he stored, in a box with a sturdy lid, the old letters that had once circulated between him and Laura. He didn't tear anything, didn't perform rituals. He carefully boxed up memories, labeled them "history," and took them to the building's storage room. The feeling wasn't of discarding, but of archiving. On the other hand, he left a recent note from Clara visible, scribbled on a bakery napkin, in which she'd said inanely that she loved the way he double-checked the stove was off before leaving. Possibly the most banal phrase in the world, but for some reason, it brought a smile to his face every time. It didn't compete with the past, it simply occupied a new space. One Friday, without planning, he walked into a small jewelry store, chose a simple ring with a clean shine, and felt his stomach tighten, not with anxiety, but with a certain respect for the act. He didn't set a date, didn't rehearse words, he kept the little box in his pocket and waited for the day when the gesture would come about by itself. Laura continued her photography classes and began accepting small jobs. Contrary to what she imagined about herself, she discovered the patience to wait for good light, learn to calibrate focus, and listen unhurriedly to the stories of the people in front of the lens. She felt useful capturing beginnings, birthdays, baptisms, and the contrast between the laughter she captured and her own biography no longer stung as before. It had become a memory that taught her not to cross boundaries. One late afternoon, she received an email from a woman named Clara, who spoke enthusiastically about a dinner with friends, a celebration of gratitude and affection, nothing pompous, simply looking for someone discreet to photograph genuine moments. Laura responded with a quote, suggested times, and arranged details. There were no last names, only trust. When she arrived at the chosen restaurant, she adjusted the camera, tested the light, and positioned herself near the piano. It was only when the group entered, laughing and hugging, that the blood drained from her face. Clara, in an ivory dress, was accompanied by a man Laura had known all her life. The unpredictability of fate didn't come with trumpets, but with white napkins and half-filled water glasses. Daniel saw her seconds later, his gaze fixed as if recognizing, accepting, and choosing. There was no theatrical awkwardness. He nodded slightly, a mature greeting. Clara, who had no idea who she was, smiled at the photographer with frank sweetness and thanked her for arriving before her friends. She wanted some photos of the setting, loved those old wood textures and low lighting. Laura held the camera steady, confirmed that everything was okay, and forced herself to focus on her work. She photographed clasped hands, the gleam of silverware, open laughing mouths, the long embrace of two friends reuniting. Meanwhile, Daniel circulated among the guests, exchanging phrases, collecting coats, being the man she always knew he could be when someone took care of the essentials. The most unexpected moment came in the middle of the night, without a speech. The music faded, Clara touched Daniel's shoulder and silently asked them to come to the corner in front of the piano. There was no stage, just a small space big enough for two. She took a small envelope from her pocket and said, smiling without any artifice, that she didn't know how to use big words, but that she wanted to choose that life with him again, every day, with the known flaws and those she would yet discover. Daniel breathed slowly, took the little box from his pocket as if tampering with a secret that no longer weighs on him, opened it, and spoke softly, with a warmth that reached the tables, that he also wanted to choose, with the simplicity that saved them from the need for grandeur. It wasn't a traditional request, it wasn't a kneel on the floor, it was a pact. Hands touched with absolute consent, and the guests burst into emotional laughter. Laura, behind the camera, froze for half a second. And then he pressed the shutter and captured something he'd never been able to keep at home, a yes that didn't need an audience, but which, by chance, had witnesses. In the bathroom, minutes later, Laura locked the door, leaned her back against the cold tile, and let out a low breath that ran through her entire body. She didn't cry with envy, didn't tremble with jealousy. She was struck by a kind of ultimate lucidity, that certain stories reach their perfect point far from where they were conceived. She remembered the phrase in her notebook, from the early morning tea party, and understood that life had just offered her a rare opportunity, to give something back with her own hands. She washed her face, returned to the salon, and worked with the precision of someone completing a clean mission. At the end, while she put away her equipment, she asked Daniel for a minute. They leaned discreetly against a column. She said she now understood everything. It wasn't just about bad choices, it was about having neglected what she silently held, and thanked him for the politeness with which he navigated the fire. Daniel nodded. There was nothing there that required long words, and simply replied that he hoped she would treat herself with the same care he had learned to show herself. Clara approached, intrigued by the respectful tone, and Laura, her heart trembling at the risk of honesty, extended her hand and introduced herself by name, without titles, without labels, simply who she was at that moment, the photographer. Clara smiled and hugged Laura with the naturalness of someone welcoming someone, unaware that she is closing an old circle. When dinner ended, Laura refused the agreed-upon price. I told Clara that her gift would be those mementos made with the best she could offer. Clara insisted, finding it strange, but Laura stood by her decision and explained, in a whisper, that sometimes the most dignified way to move on is to return to the world what was once carelessly taken. The three of them went out onto the sidewalk, where the early morning air seemed crisper, and Laura walked in the opposite direction with a strange lightness, the same as someone who leaves a weight on the table and leaves without looking back. At home, she downloaded the photos, treated each one with the care of someone sanding an antique piece of wood until it's smooth, and handed over the digital album with a short note, that those images would remind them both how simple packs are the ones that survive the storms. He deleted the copies from his computer as a gesture of respect, not avoidance. Between one folder and another, he dragged the old folder with pictures of her and Daniel into the trash, and when he confirmed it, he didn't panic. He felt peace. From that moment on, Daniel and Clara's life didn't become framed perfection, but it did acquire a rare kind of consistency. They made small mistakes and made amends, apologized naturally, left notes on the fridge when the day was getting tough, and kept the laughter at the table even on tiring days. The civil wedding was intimate, with half a dozen people and a long lunch. There was no chosen dance as an anthem for anything, but there was a lingering embrace as the sun passed through the middle of the room and ignited particles in the air, as if the atmosphere understood the agreement. Daniel sent a simple invitation to Laura, not out of provocation, but because adult truth is made of gestures that don't need to hide names. She thanked him, wished him a beautiful ceremony, and said she wouldn't attend, not out of pain, but because she knew her place. She sent a small package with a photo printed on cotton paper, the one where their hands touch unhurriedly on the table, and a note saying that beauty sometimes resides in discreet folds. For Laura, the missing impact didn't come from outside, it came from within, on a rainy March. The man she had once chosen above all else appeared again, at a bar where she was having coffee after a photo shoot. She approached with the same smile of someone who had always been the favorite novelty in her own story and pulled a cheap invitation for a weekend away from her pocket. He said, like a weather forecast, that she was better than before, that they had a chemistry no one would understand. Laura listened calmly and, in a moment of lucidity that sealed a definitive moment, replied that nothing is more seductive than what doesn't need to be sustained. She said she had learned to identify noise disguised as music and that she wasn't willing to be the audience for a repeat performance. The man made a joke about her being too romantic for someone who lived by light and lenses, and Laura got up, left the paid coffee, and left without looking back, feeling her entire body vibrate like someone closing a window before a gale. It wasn't revenge, it was healing. Months passed, and Laura transformed her classes into a small studio. The walls were covered with images of ordinary people in moments that never make it into magazines, wrinkled hands holding their first granddaughter, a mature couple laughing with their eyes closed, two brothers learning to straighten each other's ties before graduation. She also began writing short chronicles about the delicacy of staying, without obvious quotations, without the need to reveal biographies. An editor at a local website Reddit liked it, and proposed a bi-weekly column. In the first piece, she defined betrayal not as a single scene, but as the sum of small, daily surrenders, and spoke about the craft of mending one's own fabric. The piece circulated, people saw themselves there and wrote back, and Laura understood that there is no public atonement worth more than the daily work of choosing differently. At night, alone, she would turn on a yellow light, water the small plant in the window, and, when she felt brave, call her mother to talk about silly things, accepting that rapprochements are made of accumulated crumbs of conversation. One Sunday, Daniel sat next to Clara on the deserted autumn beach and, with fingers almost smiling nervously, opened the little box that hadn't been in his pocket for months. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a beautiful draft that worked. He said he wanted to formalize a path that already existed, without promising anything that wasn't theirs, but promising presence, respect, and their way of coming back when their voices fail. Clara, so exactly her, answered yes in the most Clara way possible, smiling with her eyes before her mouth, and they both laughed, not at the joke, but at the lightness of timing. Afterward, they went to eat a simple sandwich on the sidewalk and text a handful of people who matter. The next day, life continued at the same pace, because consistent love doesn't make a fuss to prove itself. Their destinies became frictionless parallels. They met once more, by chance, on an afternoon when a storm knocked out the city's power and forced everyone to take shelter in a bookstore. Daniel, with a stack of hardcover books, and Laura, with a photography magazine and an umbrella blown over by the wind. They exchanged a brief smile, the kind that acknowledges and blesses, unwilling to prolong it. They shared a few platitudes about the rain and how people rush too much, wished them a good rest of the day, and continued on. The shock, for those expecting fireworks, might have seemed modest, but sometimes the loudest impact is the silence that doesn't hurt. That scene, without an audience, without a soundtrack, was the exact image of what remained, respect and a clear space between them, where each could step in their own shoes without tripping over the other's past. At the end of this story, the outcome is less about victory and more about consequence. Daniel concluded that love isn't about shielding life from cracks, it's about learning to repair without turning the other into a carpenter of their own chaos. He looked back with those who give thanks and forward with those who build. Laura discovered that regret, when it doesn't become an excuse, can become a brick. The lover, reduced to the shallow figure he always was, disappeared as people who don't put down roots tend to disappear, not suddenly, but through insignificance. And Clara, who entered through the door someone quietly left open, established herself as a home, not through grandeur, but through coherence. There's a shock in this that doesn't scream, the revelation that not every turnaround is measured by spectacle, some are measured by the ability to not repeat what destroyed us. If this plot resonated with you, share your thoughts on this story, how you see each character's choices, and which moment resonated most with you. Your opinion matters and helps build other narratives with truth. Subscribe to the channel to follow other intense stories like this one and not miss the next chapters, which are already on the way. Here's a reflection that cuts like a blade and embraces like a lesson. Betrayal isn't just the final act, it's the sum total of silences, of misplaced priorities, of little lies that undermine what sustains a life together. It destroys families, hurts trust, steals years, erodes our self-image, and can transform potential loves into memories impossible to recover. Here, we reaffirm clearly and non-negotiably, this channel does not support betrayal of any kind. May this story serve as a warning and an invitation to make choices that honor those who walk beside you, and, above all, that honor you in the mirror.